Hello and welcome. I'm Ayushman Singh Jamwal, and we bring you the top stories from across the globe in this special segment. And big news coming in from France, ladies and gentlemen. After massive protest, a huge win for Emmanuel Macron, the French Constitutional Council has approved raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Remember, we've seen weeks of protests over this entire push by the Macron government to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. The Constitutional Council had a crucial decision to make, and now it has backed the Macron government. Remember, he was facing those violent protests on the streets of France against the decision from raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, but a huge boost to his entire pitch to reform the entire pension scheme in France, now raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. This clearance coming in from the Constitutional Council will give him the necessary push to prove that reform through the entire political hurdles that he's facing. Multiple political hurdles, primarily from Marine Le Pen and other extremist parties in France. But now a big boost to Emmanuel Macron. Those visuals, we've been seeing those visuals for days now, ladies and gentlemen, on the streets of Paris. But now he has been given that sanction from the Constitutional Council, and he can push that pension reform because he's got that boost from the Constitutional Council, which has said that the pension age can be raised from 62 to 64. I'm joined by Jannat Jalil, senior journalist, who's taking us through the entire political dynamics in France as the Constitutional Council has given a big push to Emmanuel Macron. Jannat, how does this change the political dynamics given the fact that Marine Le Pen was banking on the fact that the Constitutional Council does not back Emmanuel Macron's push?
Well, if the council hadn't backed Emmanuel Macron, it would have been a crushing blow for him. But as you say, it's a big boost for him. He's now able to pursue his pension reforms, which by European standards are actually quite modest. France still has one of the lowest pension retirement ages in the developed world. But the French believe that they have a social contract with the state, which enables them to retire at a relatively young age when they can enjoy their retirement. They feel that this is part of the French model, and they have a history of street protests. When previous governments have tried to push through pension reforms, the French have come out in large numbers and have been able to either stop them altogether or to slow them down. And this time around, it seems that Emmanuel Macron has finally got over the final hurdle. This constitutional body are composed of 9 senior, highly respected figures. It's the French equivalent to the Supreme Court. They've backed him. There's no appeal from this. There was also a proposal put forward by the far left and the far right for a referendum to be held. The Constitutional Council has rejected that as well. So he can now push ahead with these reforms. There are protests planned for tonight. They could continue till tomorrow. The authorities have banned protests in front of the building, which of the court, which is quite close to the Louvre Museum, which many of your viewers may have visited. There are anti-riot barriers there, police out in large numbers. And so it's hoped that the protests will peter out now that there is no chance of the Constitutional Court going against Mr. Macron. But even if the protests peter out, the anger is very unlikely to die down. About 2/3 of the French were opposed to this pension age rise. And the big fear for Mr. Macron, I think, is more long term. Could the deep anger that many French people feel over this change to the pension law result in a far-right politician, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right party, coming to power in the next presidential election?
Right, but Jannat, as you were clearly pointing out that the push from the Constitutional Council is on one side, but the other side is the politics. I'm looking at this poll that was published earlier this month by the French business channel BFM TV. It showed that if there was a vote today between Macron and Le Pen, the sitting president would lose. That political reality is something Macron still has to confront.
Exactly. And that's what I was just saying, that when the next presidential election is held, it's not for another 3 to 4 years, then Marine Le Pen could come back and this time around could actually defeat the more centrist candidate. It won't be Mr. Macron. He's only allowed to serve 2 terms. But there might be so much disillusionment with mainstream politicians that people might decide to give the far right a try. And we've already seen that in Italy. We saw people in Britain and the United States going for politicians who were outside the mainstream in Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Politicians are able to sell more populist messages. And that's something that Marine Le Pen was very careful to do. And in last year's presidential election, she actually did pretty well. She doubled her share of the vote from the previous presidential election. She made it through to the final two. And she had a message that she was listening to people's concerns. She understood their worries about the cost of living, that she was someone who was listening, who was in contact with the reality that they suffered. Whereas a lot of French people feel that President Macron doesn't understand them. He's arrogant. He's aloof. They've nicknamed him the president of the rich. And so there is a great deal of anger. And now it remains to be seen whether those protests will die down. People will come to accept this, if somewhat reluctantly. But the big fear is, what will this mean for elections in the future? Because it's not just Mr. Macron who has disappointed French voters. There have been previous presidents before him. The French have tried the right in Nicolas Sarkozy. They've tried the left in Francois Hollande. They both promised to make life better for the French, promised to increase wages, to reduce unemployment, and they failed to deliver. If the French feel that Mr. Macron has failed to deliver again, then perhaps they will turn to the far right.
Right. And Janet, these violent scenes that we have seen on the streets of France is something you rarely see from the French nation, such violent protests taking place, namely even in the city of Paris. How has that affected the political narrative when it comes to the entire pension debate?
I think it's worth stressing that most of these protests have been peaceful. And what you usually have on the fringes of these protests are a group of troublemakers known as les casseurs, the breakers. And they're usually youths who are dressed all in black. They bring rocks and rubble with them. They throw them at the police. The police respond with tear gas and try to sort of quell these protests. So there's usually some violent clashes on the fringes of these protests. And these casseurs are usually young middle-class youth from France. But the trade unions, the people that are coming out because they're worried about their retirement, a lot of people say that actually in France it's very hard for a person to keep their job till the age of 62 or 64, because a lot of people who are in their 50s are made redundant or find it very difficult to move to another job. So those people, they're just taking part in peaceful protests. It's a tradition in France that goes back to the overthrow of the monarchy a couple of centuries ago. People come out to the streets. They want to demonstrate their feelings. They want to make the politicians sit up and listen. And that's what the French have been doing. And today, some protesters have been saying they won't give up. They will carry on their protests. But it's very hard to see where they can go from here.
Right. And beyond the pension debate, are we seeing this wider disaffection with the political system in France? Because Macron used those special legislative powers and bypassed Parliament when it came to this entire pension debate that has been raging in France for many days now. Is there, in your sense, a wider disaffection with the political system which has led to this much anger on the streets?
That's a very good point you make, that Mr. Macron couldn't risk having a vote in the lower house of parliament because he feared that he would lose that. So he used a special constitutional measure in order to force this deeply unpopular pension reform through Parliament, and it is a legal measure that he can use. But it's something that a lot of French protesters said rendered this illegitimate. And the reason he was forced to do this was because when he was re-elected last year, he managed to win the presidential election because he was standing against a far-right candidate. And a lot of people were very unhappy at the choice they had. They felt like, the phrase I kept hearing all the time was, it's like choosing between the plague and the cholera. You've either got this deeply unpopular, very arrogant, as a lot of people see him, politician in Emmanuel Macron, or you have the far-right leader, Marine Le Pen. And so what happened was, the month after he was elected president, or a couple of months after, there were the parliamentary elections, and his party lost its majority in the parliament, which then put it in a very difficult position because it had to do deals with other parties. The centre-right and the centre-left have lost a lot of ground. They're just reduced. The two parties that used to dominate French politics are reduced to a much smaller number of MPs in parliament. And what we have seen in the French parliament is a far greater number of far-right MPs, a far greater number of far-left MPs, and they have been doing all they can to make life difficult for Emmanuel Macron because they feel that they should be having more of a say in how France is governed. But what he would say is, look, I have to do these unpopular things because France simply can't afford to pay these pensions because of the huge deficit that France has. So he's saying, I'm going to do the right thing, but not the popular thing. But the opposition politicians in the French parliament are saying, you're actually not listening to the people.
Right, and Janat, just to talk purely about the politics currently taking place in France, is there an issue when it comes to the leadership crisis within Macron's own party? Is there a factor at play that Macron doesn't have any successor? There's no known successor to Macron, and he can't run for a second term beyond 2027?
Well, I mean, he was re-elected last year. He's still got 4 more years to go. So there's plenty of time to choose a successor. There has been talk of various figures who could come to the fore ahead of the next presidential election. But usually in France, those politicians that want to stand for the presidency don't declare until quite late. And right now, I think there is a general disaffection with the political class. A lot of people feel that they're out of touch. So it will be interesting to see who will come forward, but it's too early to predict. But the big fear for Mr. Macron is that Marine Le Pen is keeping very quiet. She's not saying much. She's just sitting by. The far left politicians are much more vocal, and some would say perhaps that they are perhaps too vocal. They're trying to encourage a revolution or revolt, whereas Marine Le Pen is trying to look like a serious, responsible politician. So she is the figure that a lot of people are watching because she has a far greater number of MPs in Parliament. She's actually urged them to cooperate with Mr. Macron to show that she is a responsible politician. And she will no doubt have been heartened by the example of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who is a far-right leader, who since coming to power has actually shown herself to be a very canny operator and has actually pleased a lot of people, both in Italy and outside Italy, by her moderate stance on issues such as the war in Ukraine.
Right, and how do you see the politics in France now play out after this big decision that's coming from the Constitutional Council for Emmanuel Macron? Do you think he can claw back some of the credibility that he's lost over these protests? Or the fact of the matter is, the reason that you're seeing so much anger on the streets of France is because of the basic push of raising the retirement age. Do you think that is the point of contention, and there is no way that Emmanuel Macron can take back that credibility unless he tanks this entire reform push?
Well, he's got the pension age rise. That's done. Now we wait to see how long these protests will continue. We'll see if the anger can be maintained or whether people will decide that there's no point continuing to support a lost cause. He also has other plans to reform France's economy. He wants to make it more business friendly. He's already introduced various reforms to do that. But it has to be pointed out that this pension reform is actually quite modest. When he initially came to power in 2017, he wanted to completely overhaul the French pension system. It's very complicated. There are dozens of different schemes, and he wanted to completely streamline it and make it much more efficient. He had to abandon that because of the COVID pandemic. So this is a relatively modest reform, and look at the struggle he's had to push that through. Look how hard it's been for him. He hasn't been able to hold a vote in Parliament. He's faced 3 months of protests, all these opposition politicians coming against him. He can't get a majority in Parliament. So it's very hard to see how he can continue with his reform agenda. And we've seen he's a very ambitious politician. He likes to think big thoughts. We've heard him talking about China and the US and what France's position would be when it came to any possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And sometimes those grand ideas that he espouses can alienate allies. Some people in Europe are very alarmed by the way he's been talking about Taiwan, for instance. And domestically, he does have big ideas, but whether he can deliver on them remains to be seen, because he is someone who has upset and angered and alienated a lot of people. He's not been able to get to political allies in Parliament, and he would need those in order to be able to carry out some more of his ambitious reform agenda.
Right. Thank you, Janat Jalil, for giving us your perspective on the changing dynamics in French politics after this big boost has come for Emmanuel Macron from the Constitutional Council, which has said that his reform push to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 is constitutionally valid. But protesters have been expressing their dismay with the French administration in a rather expressive fashion as they awaited the judgment. Now that the French constitution has ruled in favor of Macron, more protests are set to break out. Now have a look at this exclusive clip from inside a university where the French president was delivering a speech.
you delivered such strong messages, not just for Europe, but for humanity and our common values. Hello.
I think we lost something. Where is French democracy? Where did we lost it? Where did we lost it?
I can answer this question if you give me some time.
Nobody listens. You have millions of people in the streets. Conventions of climate has been put aside. What can you say when you talk about Europe?
These type of expressions are forbidden. And this is why I do believe. There are places where you can have violence. This is exactly places where this type of expressions are forbidden. And this is why I do believe it's very important to have social debate. I don't know, and I can answer all the questions you have on what we are discussing in France, the law we are passing, and how this is a democracy. And a democracy is exactly a place where you can demonstrate, you can have, as in your country, this type of interventions. But as in the world, we are places where democracy doesn't exist. We should not compare precisely the two situations.
And right, so even though he's got that boost from the Constitutional Council, he still faces a lot of political hurdles when it comes to that entire pension debate.